And welcome back to another episode of Alfacast. I'm Mike Winter, and I'm here as always with Dr. Bear Paul Lando up here on the Smith River in the great state of Jefferson on the border of California and Oregon. Today we have a really amazing show considering Walter Russell plays so much into what we do here at Alpha Vedic. We have Matt Presti on today, president of the University of Science and Philosophy. And we are just thrilled to go deep into Walter Russell today. Alpha Vedic, if any of you are aware of Alpha Vedic and what our branding is and everything we do, we integrate Walter Russell into our technology, into our products, and pretty much our core philosophy. So this is really special for us. We're very delighted to have Matt Presti on. Like I said, he's the president of the University of Science and Philosophy. And he's returning again. He was on originally last year. So if you want to hit pause, if you're listening to this podcast or watching this on YouTube, you can hit pause and go back and watch the original one we had with he and Darren Colum, where we went over a lot of the technology around Walter Russell. Today, we're going to focus a little bit more on his cosmogony and core philosophies, and just kind of go down deep the rabbit hole of Walter Russell. But if you want to hit pause and go watch that first, that'll give you a wonderful background. But today we're going to, like I said, travel deeper down the Russell rabbit hole, reveal what could be the remedy to every issue we presently witness through world events. The most critical element of this science-based perspective is the inescapable conclusion that each and every one of us is the solution we seek. Dr. Walter Russell's teachings give to mankind a scientific and living philosophic understanding of man himself, the mind of man, the soul of man, and his relationship to the universal one. The unfoldment of the coming sense or new faculty, commonly referred to as cosmic consciousness, stands before mankind in this dawning electric age. It is ours for the asking. Metascientist, musician, philosopher, poet, practitioner of universal law, natural science, and living philosophy, audio and video producer, broadcaster, host of the series Interviews and Exploration of Consciousness, currently serving as president of the University of Science and Philosophy, formerly the Walter Russell Foundation since January 1st, 2016. We welcome Matt Presti. How are you today, Matt?
Thank you, Mike. I'm doing well. How are you?
Wonderful. Thanks so much. And how are you today, Bear?
I'm doing good. Thank you. Just telling Matt off air that we've already had a full day. We're in the midst of planting here, and we're a little bit behind. As we always say, we're going to get ahead of it this year, but we never quite do because there's so much. But anyway, yeah, everything's good, just kind of farming lifestyle. So Matt, great to see you here. Thanks so much. I know you're a busy man, and it means a lot to us to have you here and make time for us. Last time when we talked on air, I was saying how when I found the work of Walter Russell through you, I started watching some of your videos online, and that was quite a few years ago now. For the first time ever, I could make sense out of my metaphysical studies and then have a link between them and, what I learned in, my conventional studies in medicine and so forth. And all of a sudden, not only was that link there and a real scientific basis for it, but a lot of my alternative medicine practices like Chinese medicine and so forth, I no longer had to rely on cultural terms and, different historical times where they use terminologies that are foreign to us here in the West. And so Walter Russell, I always considered the missing link, and thanks to you, I found him because you've done an amazing body of work just putting his work out. I see you're in your man cave there today. After I got into Walter Russell, I got equally as enthused about your work as a musician. Matt is an accomplished musician and just amazing. And in fact, when you get into the work of Walter Russell, since we're talking about the universe being a product of tonal fields, I say, I guess you could say it that way even. I think a musician probably has a better chance at understanding Walter's work than somebody like myself that has a background in conventional sciences. So welcome, Matt. Good to have you here. I'd love to talk about a whole lot of things. You have 40 acres that you live on. You have a certain amount of self-sufficiency and grow your own food and raise chickens. And I'm just as happy to talk about those sorts of things and also about your music. But I know a lot of our audience wants to dive a little deeper into Walter Russell. So we should probably start there. And I just want to say one last thing, and then we'll just let you talk the remainder. I heard your interview on Crow 777, which was great. And as I mentioned, alchemy and metaphysics and those sorts of things that always seem to be a little bit mystical, but Walter Russell brings them into more of a scientific light. The way you explained the circle and the square in the old alchemical, symbology, Walter Russell brought alchemy to a three-dimensional state. And that to me was the best thing I ever heard, to just distinctly, create an understanding about what Walter Russell did. So Matt, wherever you'd like to take it away.
Oh, thank you. I just have to thank my nephew, Joe, for purchasing 33 acres next to us, which I'm the steward for. And he's a great guy and also a fellow Russell student. But I think it's important, especially with all that's going on in the world, that we all start looking at practicing some form of self-sufficiency. That government is not the end all be all. And, that's part of what the Russell teachings taught me, was a lot of self-sufficiency. Instead of going to other people with your problems, talk with God about it, which is an internal dialogue that takes place between your conscience, your still small voice, and yourself, really. So there's two sets of two directions of thinking outwardly, which could be called the ego, which is necessary, in balance with the ego, which is the internal direction of thinking. So, everything must have an opposite, but there's always a fulcrum between the opposites. And the goal is to get to the fulcrum so that you choose the opposite when it's time or when it's needed. So, I wrote a post recently, and people can visit minds.com/Matt Presti and read all my posts that are archived there. But basically, we have death as one half of the wave of creation and life as the other. And it's really up to us which one we want to choose. And a lot of the things we're seeing in the world today are just, the worship of the death half of the wave. Cities burning, division, riots, things of that nature are all an expression of the death half of the wave, which you could call, deconstruction or destruction, exhalation, things of this nature, those opposites that are on the left hand of the spectrum. And then you have your right hand spectrum of opposites, which are creation, construction, thinking, and so on. But each and every opposite can be centered within by the fulcrum, allowing one to more or less not to escape duality, but to no longer be a slave to it. And that's really one of the great things that Russell brought to me, was he pointed out, again, like you said, the going from two-dimensional alchemy to three-dimensional alchemy, which is also three-dimensional hermeticism. And when you act from a place of knowing versus just thinking either inwardly or outwardly, you're able to choose whichever course of action is more necessary at the moment. And I think that's what cosmic, man truly is becoming, is a person, an individual who has found and made a relationship with the center of themselves and develops and inculcates that ability to either create or destroy. And that's kind of a large responsibility. But in rounding out to your comment about three-dimensional alchemy, the great thing about the Russell teachings, unlike other teachings, is it's not just a duality teaching, it's a triality teaching. And he emphasizes so many times about the fulcrum as being the location of the creator, which would be our soul as part of the universal soul. And you see all these other writings by illuminates throughout history, mystics throughout history, and time immemorial, who talk about this center point of stillness, of silence, which is contradictory, honestly, to the New Age movement talking about raising our vibrations. You know, the actual best advice comes from the mystics, not New Age teachers, but mystics who say lower your vibration towards stillness. Learn to listen to the still small voice inside you, which is a very quiet knowing, and it doesn't speak in words, it speaks in waves, and it will instruct you as to your decision. And it's more or less also in line with the Heart Math Institute, which says ask your heart the question, not your head. So there's a lot of just, you know, synchronicities and alignments within these different fields of study, especially about psychology, the mind, spirituality, and they all start to, you know, for me, because of understanding the Russell teachings, they start to weave together. And that's one of the beautiful things I think you take away from the Russell teachings, is the ability to go back and reread things you might have read years ago and find the golden threads that unify those things together. Once you put that third strand of DNA, which is not really a strand, it's a divisionary line of equilibrium, which unites the divided self, the two hemispheres. And that's why, you know, the Nazarene said, seek ye the kingdom of heaven within. It's not out here. It's right here in the center of our two hemispheres. And that's where we learn to develop and inculcate a moment-to-moment relationship with the Creator, which is our own conscience, to the degree that we're aware that it is.
So, Matt, I'd like to get your take on this. You know, you go into the work of Tesla. He talks about the magic of 9, the 3 times 3. All the mystical schools were 9, and the 3 times 3. Going to the Enneagram, the Sufi system of emotional profiling, and it's the same thing. It's that you know, that same diagram that you see over and over again. So now, taking Walter Russell and acknowledging him as, you know, turning the circle and the square into 3-dimensionality as far as the cube and the sphere. And you know, you can explain it better than myself, but the cube, of course, creates the 6 planes that, you know, allow the interface of the electrical vectors to create the sphere. But then in the middle of that, the final 3 is the XYZ axis, right? That allows the final third there. So how would you explain, if we were to look at the cube, the sphere, the inner XYZ 3-dimensional axis, how would we explain that as far as, or how could we think of those? Like would the 3-dimensionality inside the cube, would that be our soul that's interjecting, or would that be the creator? Anyway, just how could you help us understand all of that?
Right. Well, the cube is the sphere expanded, and the sphere is the cube compressed, as Russell taught. And basically what that means is around every body in existence, be it an atom or a galaxy, is an invisible cube of 0 motion, absolute cold, and 0 curvature. And basically that's the invisible space geometry, which is also what Euclid discovered: straight lines, the triangle, the square, the, you know, the hexagon, so on and so forth. Of course, there are no straight lines in nature, but behind nature, the mind scaffolding that creates the curvature forms that are myriad in nature are all done so through that invisible space geometry, which is the scaffolding. Of course, you have to build scaffolding to build an arch. And I would say, if anybody could, you know, YouTube or Google the building of the arch or any Capitol dome, you'll see a lot of straight line structure around all this curvature prior to the curvature coming into existence. It can't happen any other way. So the very scaffolding construction sites use to build curved domes, the arch, for instance, again, or just, you know, a lot of different buildings for that matter are straight line, you know, forms. And so that discovery of Euclid, the Platonic solids, was a huge one, which benefited architecture and enabled man to also go beyond his limits with building at that time. The 369, basically, when you have that cube that surrounds the body, you have your 8 corners, and then your center point is 9. And so that would be, as Walter said, the point in the center is the creator, but then so is the cube that surrounds it. So the 6 planes of 0 curvature, absolute cold, are the location of the creator. And the points are the dynamic spherical bodies that reflect light from one wave field to another. Much like a mirror, they reverse direction at that corner point. So all bodies are, holographic in nature. Around every cell is a cube. Around every atom is a cube. Around every galaxy is a cube. The cubes don't move, but they're omnipresent as needed as a body moves. In much the same way, your consciousness moves with the body. I should say the body moves upon the conscious field. And a great picture to look at, and I've said this in many past interviews, is look up inverted galaxies. Type inverted galaxy into a search engine and look at some of the images. And you'll see that white field, which is dark to our senses, when you illuminate space, you're actually showing basically a God selfie. God is that field of mind, which is everywhere. It's omnipresent, omniscient, and omnipotent. And this comes directly from Walter's teachings, his drawings of the real universe of the white magnetic light of mind, which is dark to man's senses. So that mind field is literally everywhere. That's why you can go to the South Pole, the North Pole, you could go to the equator, and consciousness is still there. It doesn't disappear because you go too far south or north, or even into space, or even to the moon. So ultimately, consciousness is literally everywhere. It's your body that's not everywhere and is confined to its own cube wave field. But yeah, the 369 is basically, Nikola Tesla knew, and he also, as I've said before too, advised Russell to lock his teachings away in a sepulcher for 1,000 years because mankind wasn't unfolded enough. But I think he is unfolded enough, and I think a lot of us are ready. And the beauty of the Russell teachings is that they can be applied to so many fields, farming, biology, chemistry, you name it, engineering, metallurgy, all these different fields. And many people have actually applied to all these different fields a lot of these teachings and come up with some really incredible new alloys. And I've talked to people in chemical companies that have used his research and his charts. And, there's a lot of benefits that can come from this. It can literally transform society as we know it.
Matt,
Yeah.
in terms of Walter being an illuminary versus, a philosopher or just a thinker, could you give our audience a little breakdown on what that means and his experience and how, with that, the concept of where he got this information? Because I think it's a fascinating concept and what makes him so unique compared to a lot of, philosophers and thinkers and artists, et cetera, from the last, 2,000 years.
Yeah. Well, Walter Russell had no special interest in science. In fact, it wasn't until his illumination of 1921, May, which actually occurred during a solar mass coronal ejection, I believe, which knocked out telecom wires and telecommunication wires back in that time as well in New York. But interestingly that it coincided with that. But basically the illumination experience is one where you leave the dualistic electric mode of your brain. There's an electric short circuit between the lobes and you enter into the white light of mind. Sometimes people don't fully enter. It's just a flash. Like for instance, H.W. Percival stepped off a curb in New York City. And for an instantaneous 5-second period of time, he experienced the white light. He ended up spending the next 40 years of his life trying to communicate that experience through his novels, Thinking and Destiny, Volume 1 and 2. There's a lot of people. Walt Whitman had multiple flashes of light, which enabled him to write Leaves of Grass and so many other things. The great poets, the incredible artists, even musicians. In sports, you can experience the flash, which they also call the zone. And so your body operates almost out of time in a perfect sync with your environment. And so that's what some people, like Dr. Morris Buck, said he believes that mankind is entering into the age of cosmic awareness, where we're just becoming more centered. And that's what a lot of these mystics and authors, Lao Tzu and others going back throughout time, have tried to bring to man, was the awareness of his own divinity, which is tapped dead center of your body. It unites the two hemispheres. And so with Russell's illumination, 1921, it was very typical of all the other illuminates, who I recommend a great book by Dr. Richard Morris Buck, called Cosmic Consciousness. And he studied some 40 cases of people who had this experience. And Walter Russell was not one of those people, because it was written prior to Dr. Russell's experience, and Buck had already passed in 1901. But nonetheless, the experience was a classical one. It would have fit directly into Dr. Buck's research. And for 39 days, Russell experienced this light of mind. He wrote down some 40,000 words and drew hundreds of charts and drawings from this experience, which were chemistry charts, drawings of the wave of creation, scientific charts, and many others, as well as his 40,000 words that he called the message of the divine Iliad, which was his divine journey into that light. He would often have these experiences from childhood, every year around his birthday from the age of 7, but major ones every 7 years. So at 7, 14, when he had his near-death experience, he actually did die of black diphtheria and reawoke completely healed from it after 2 doctors had pronounced him dead. He had one at the age of 21, major one, and then his biggest and most major at 49 years old, which was the 7 times 7. And so that was his 39-day illumination. You can go just on for hours about the incredibleness of all the research. I've tried to compile a lot of this research of illumination into my series, Knowing the Creator 101, which can be found on YouTube if you just type that out. But basically that attempts to, break down what illumination is to a more advanced degree with more definition. But it is the rarest of all human experiences, and it is what allowed him to present a new chemistry in his 1926 book, The Universal One, a new cosmogony to the world of science. He printed 1,000 books. 300 went to major universities, and the other 700 went to prominent scientists of the day. And basically his reaction from those folks, where only a few got back to him, he said, science laughed at, speaking of the Universal One, science laughed at it, scoffed at it, and threw it in the wastebasket. So he really felt rejected and hurt by the fact that he had presented this to them. But at that point, science was already on a course toward godlessness and removing the creator from creation. And he felt that was their cardinal error.
Yeah, the reductionist model that was really expanded from, the Age of Enlightenment was at that point pretty much fully adopted. And now we're seeing that evoked in a way that is leading us to a really perilous state where most of humanity has adopted this. It's kind of like we have this duality of thought where we either have the religious Abrahamic traditions really dominating on the religious spiritual side, or we have the materialistic reductionism. And look what's happening in the world right now. It's a schizophrenic confusion because we just don't have the ontological basis for really what reality is. Question, Bear and I were talking about this last week in terms of free will, and this relates a lot to what the problem is right now. And I've been exploring these notions of late, that the reductionist model is all based on cause and effect. And in that notion, we have no free will. Everything is related to what we do is related to some specific cause that predates anything that we decide. And it's really a depressing notion. And then on the more religious side, the idea is that our will comes from a Godhead or something like that. And if you really break it down, there's not really a notion of free will there either. If you kind of really go deep into those ideas, what would Walter Russell, how would he explain free will? Because I assume he believed in free will because of the ontological nature of Russellian dynamics here. So, Matt, could you break down Russell's kind of view of how free will works?
Yeah, I think he basically in his model, he and Leo taught the cause and effect model. Cause is mind, cause is God, cause is stillness, silence from which sound and motion spring and return to. Mind, when it develops to a point, say in the human being, is no longer controlled by instinct. And the proof of free will is the very fact that we have evil. Without free will, there would be no evil, which is why the Russells blamed mankind for evil and not nature. You don't find evil anywhere in nature. I know people have written, in the materialist points of view that an earthquake or a volcano is evil. It's certainly not, basically evil would not exist without free will. And the proof of that is in nature. In nature, you see perfect harmony, balance, rhythmic balanced interchange. If there is a volcanic explosion, it quickly balances itself out. It's not a continuous, 10,000 year eruption, or, a lioness hunts a gazelle, but doesn't kill them all in a war. You see, they take one, the violence of nature is just one half of the spectrum, but it's an instinctual control. The Russells called nature, basically said nature was under God control. That's why you don't see free will. Animals do exactly what they've been instinctualized to do and are under that God control. Humans have been freed from that God control. And so therefore, because we've been freed from it, we can choose the life half of the wave or the death half of the wave of creation to exercise our free will. And when we choose life, life swings at both ends of our pendulum of our choice. A lot of people in our student body are confused when we talk about life swinging at both ends of the pendulum, because in dualistic thought, in materialistic thought, you really tend to think in opposites, and that's unfortunate, because when you think as a fulcrumized human, you basically can choose which opposite to apply as a solution or not. And the life and the death half of the wave is complete when you see it for what it is. So that choice, that free will choice of either choosing life or death, and not all death is evil. Mowing your grass is necessary. You don't do it with the intent to murder your grass, or you don't drive your vehicle with the intent to murder bugs, but it just happens. So intent is a lot of it, but free will basically, again, if evil exists, it's because of free will. And that's the one thing that nature lacks, is free will. It does not lack instinct. In fact, most of nature is instinct, except for us. We're the only beings that I'm aware of on the planet that can just completely screw things up outside of their program, which proves to me that that must be free will. And in the case of determinism, you have to make a choice to believe in determinism instead of free will. So that is a kill shot against determinism, because if you didn't choose freely to believe determinism, we should all, by value of the very theory of determinism, believe in it automatically.
I
know, isn't that funny? What a paradox there, huh?
Yeah, a glaring paradox.
Another thing with the human experience, it seems not only do we have free will, but our biology actually supports that. And I don't know, Matt, how much you're aware of a medical discipline developed in Germany called New Germanic Medicine.
I don't believe I've heard of that.
So a gentleman by the name of Dr. Hammer, who's another one of those very special people on the planet that just came tapped in, he was a conventional medic. And what he understood is that we embryologically unfold to incorporate all the different components of the animal kingdom, and with it are those instinctual reactions. However, when our social counterparts of, the animal life, for instance, might be a survival situation in the animal kingdom, Whereas in a human experience, we translate it into a social issue, you know, relative to abandonment, or, you know, all the issues we have about survival, you know, linked to money and that sort of thing. So when those events happen and create a trauma or a conflict in the psyche, then what he found and demonstrated by CAT scan is that a very specific part of the brain would be triggered by the psyche, which I like because it also, you know, brings in the fact that electrical vectors are affecting biology. And then he established that from that trigger in the brain, it would hit the corresponding area in the body to holographically represent the trauma that would then allow it to relieve the pressure that maybe an animal or somebody just on, you know, basic instinct reactional kind of behavior. The pressure is relieved by our biology. Unfortunately, the medical profession has mistaken that as disease, and they impede that process, and we could go further into how we screw that up. But if it was left on its own, and back in my early experience, you know, looking through, you know, doing autopsies and things, you'd see scars in the body where cancers would come and go. That was just the norm, and now it's not the norm anymore, and there's reasons for that. But the point is biology holographically expresses those electrical vectors that are, you know, first trigger the brain center, the corresponding body area, the body acts it out, pressure is relieved, and then it gives, I believe what the design is just my own speculation, is it gives mankind the ability to transcend reactionary instinctual behavior into more of a rational, conscious sort of behavior.
Oh, that's very interesting. You mentioned holographic, and, you know, you think of obviously the holographic nature of the universe, and within the mind itself, basically the holographic nature of reality is a infinite complexity of as above, so below, and as within, so without. So yeah, that's a great thing to consider, that, you know, if we holographically envision healing on a different level, how would that affect the body if they're interrelated? And of course, it's an electric universe, a spiral fractal dynamic holographic optical universe, not a gravitic radiative one, as and an exhalatory universe as current mainstream science believes. So yeah, those kinds of dynamics for healing are, you know, unspeakably cool to consider, you know, where we could take this if these things are applied. You should send me a link and email for that.
Oh yeah, you'll love
discipline.
it. Walter Russell, of course, was the first one that you know, explained how the hologram works, and maybe you could talk more about that as far as how these vectors reproduce themselves over and over and over again. So when you understand the basic principles that make logical sense to, I think, most people that delve into his work, then you realize that anything that happens on any level has to be the same thing repeating over and over. So if I'm a doctor type and I'm looking at something in the body, how can I not go to that level of, you know, a little bit upstream where those vectors are originating from the first place? And it also explains exactly how Dr. Hammer's work with New German medicine is actually spot on. You know, we have instruments now where we can read the wave fields emanating from the body or from a DNA sample, and so-called inanimate objects either, and understand where the you know, the forces are skewed, you know, in the northwest, north-south, or east-west polarities, and then also be able to extrapolate what that means on a biological level, and then give you, you know, ideas on how to treat. So, you know, that's where, in my experience, when I started studying Walter Russell, he explained all these things that we were involved with, but there was that little gap in between of not quite connecting the dots, but intuitively knowing that it was right on. And you know, so maybe if you could expound a little bit about how the hologram reproduces itself.
Yeah, well, light travels I should just say light does not travel according to Walter Russell. It's reproduced wave field to wave field. So let's just take sunlight, for instance. Apparently, they say it takes 8 seconds for so-called photons to leave the sun and travel to the earth. Walter would say that light never leaves the sun, that its radiation is expressed and hits its cubic wave field boundary. So there's a cube surrounding the sun, as well as the earth, as well as, like I said earlier, every body in motion. When it hits that wave field, it's at maximum expanse. So think of it like a gunshot or somebody using a hammer. If you're far enough away from that person hitting that hammer or firing that gun, you won't hear it. And what happens to the sound wave is it's very compressed. That's why when your ear is right up next to a speaker at a rock concert, it'll blow your eardrum out, right? So the farther away you get from that speaker, the more expansive that spherical wave pattern becomes. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger until the waves are so low and so spread out that it no longer can reconstitute in your ear. What radar made possible was able to recompress waves. So the waves of enemy planes that are created through their going through the atmosphere could be shrunk back down, much like satellite communication between your satellite on your house and a satellite in space. You know, that wave reaches a maximum point of expansion, and because you have a counter corner, radar corner reflector, that wave then shrinks back down into a discernible signal to the human ear and eye. And much in the same way, the sunlight radiates from the sun, expands outward to its wave field boundary of zero curvature, and then reverses and reconstitutes and compresses into heat and light on the surface of the earth. So that's about the best way I can explain it. But, you know, basically there's always two motions, and a compression and an expansion. So the wave fields of space compress into the sun, and at the sun's equator expand back out into space. Much like two poles of every planet breathe in the 3 octaves of elements prior to hydrogen, which are full-toned elements that science really has yet to discover. They've discovered some, but they falsely call them isotopes. They're actually full-toned elements, according to Russell. So these are what Russell called the invisible space gases. Those are compressed and breathed in through the poles of every object, including our 2 nostrils. We breathe in, and we have to reverse course and exhale through our equator, right? This is our equator, and these are our 2 hemispheres, perfectly matched. And that is always, we could breathe in the ice cold air of the Arctic and still exhale heat. In much way, the planet will breathe in the cold gases of space and then exhale heat at the equators. And that's really, if you just look at all bodies as breathing entities, you'll really start to understand Russell's science better, because you can't, and especially as to the location of the creator. This is one more beautiful point that I think would go a long way to satisfy science as to how we are bound and centered by the mind field, which we call God. Again, think of that inverted galaxy picture, that white light that's omnipresent, which all bodies move upon. That's the great mirror that does not lie. So if we put out a thought of destruction, what do you see as the reflection? Destruction, right? And we've seen it on the news night after night, you know, defacing, tearing things down, destroying. That's because that's what's in the mind. And when that is projected onto the surface outer world, that's the perfect reflection. The creator will reflect whatever you put out. And that's why I say, when you fulcrumize, you can put out death or you can put out life. That is your free will choice. And nobody's bound to make any choice other than their own free will. There are parts in cellular structures, and our breathing process, for instance, is instinct controlled. Our heart beats by instinct. If we had to think of our heart beating, what is it, 45 times a minute on average, how would we be able to get anything else done? If we had to think about breathing and digesting and doing all the things our body does instinctually, we wouldn't have time to plan or to make or to create. So fortunately, God runs a lot of that for us. But in the breathing process, to locate God, When you breathe in, you can only go so far. You hit a cubic wave field boundary. You have to reverse direction. And then you breathe out all the way. You hit the cubic wave field again. You're actually meeting God. Okay, that's an interesting prospect. He's right there all the time. Couldn't so much as lift your little finger. And I mean the great mother, father. It's the one, as they call it. But it is that mind field that is omnipresent throughout the universe, controlling, centering, and bounding all motions, and reflecting the minds of the free will choices of the human race. And I guess that's a good place to turn it back over to you. I could go on for hours and hours. You know.
Yeah, I could listen to you for hours. So you mentioned movement, and there's really no movement. So are what we talking about when we talk about the speed of light, for instance, 186,400 miles per second or something? So what we're talking about is a sequential outpicturing, like almost like it takes that many frames to go by rather than things actually moving. How would you explain that?
Well, Walter would say that considering like uranium and plutonium, the emission rate of those kinds of elements is very high. And I believe that's where we got our measurement of light at 186,000 miles per second. Some of the other elements like hydrogen may not reproduce its wave field that quickly. So, you know, prior to hydrogen, we don't see any wave field emission with our human eye because it's too small. Or I would say the waves are too long for us to constitute into an electric sensation. So again, God is not a vibration. There is absolutely no vibration to the spirit whatsoever, the Russells wrote, which is why science can't find the creator and why they've replaced the looking for the creator with this so-called God particle or dark matter, or there's a myriad of other terms which are all materialistic in their nature. But mind is really the field that they should understand. They removed mind from creation, which is cause, and have since tried to explain cause using effects to explain it. So it's like using the sound of a gunshot to explain a bullet. It doesn't explain it at all. When it's the mind that pulls the trigger, it's completely losing sight of the artist behind creation. Again, as he said, when science removed the creator from creation, that was their cardinal error, because you removed cause from the effect of creation. You can search all you want for Leonardo da Vinci and the Mona Lisa. You will not find him. You will just find drops of paint. You could go into the paint, zoom in as far as you want. You will not find the soul of Leonardo da Vinci, though his mind is the creator that painted it. And so like the poem is not the poet, the play is not the playwright, the symphony is not the composer. And these are the kinds of things Walter would use to explain, you know, how you think mentally about the creator and the mind field, which you're a part of. You're a drop in that ocean.
Yeah, the after effects. Always looking at the after effects. That's the problem with modern science, right? And that's the crux of the whole issue that they have. You know, some things interesting that are happening in science is like the psychology studies where they've proven precognition, that humans have the ability. I forgot the gentleman who did the study. I think it was in the 2000s, and then it was repeated in 2014, where they did a study where they had individuals see a random string of numbers and try to remember as many as they could, and then they had them write them down. And they found that those that wrote them down after actually were able to better remember before, if that makes any sense. So they were able to show that we have some sort of precognition, and that really messes with their idea of time and our ability and how time works and how our mental state works. And I have a feeling that Walter Russell will be able to explain this in a very simple way. What was the kind of aspect of how time relates to matter in terms of Russell versus the more classic relativity that like an Einstein had developed?
Right. Well, Einstein borrowed his fourth dimensional time as basically from Edwin Abbott, who wrote the book Flatlanders and introduced this idea of a dimension beyond the third. Time doesn't really exist. I mean, it's a mental construct, one could say. Think of time as distance. Think of time like a tape measure. We can measure distance in feet, inches, miles, you know, and we can also measure time in seconds, minutes, hours, days, and such. But really, it doesn't have an existence. It's just a measuring tape. And so really the only time is now, and it's happening everywhere in the universe right at this very moment. And we can think backward in so-called time or forward in time, but we can't move the whole universe forward or backward in time. It just is. And I think being comfortable with that fact, you know, you'll come to be able to express more joy in your life, knowing that you can't do anything to change the moment, which is eternal. It's an eternal moment in an eternal universe of rhythmic balanced interchangings and simulations we call bodies. The beauty of Russell is, you know, he in the Universal One, he mentioned 18 dimensions. And again, we have this science fiction about dimensions, which are parallel universes right next to us where we're doing other things, the opposite of what we're doing here. There's all these science fiction phantasmagorias that populate the human imagination. But we have a very real three-dimensional universe of dimensionality, which Russell said there are basically 18 dimensions. I'll name just a few as an example: color, temperature, length, breadth, width, weight, time, tone. These are actual dimensions of a third dimensional reality. There's no need to go into a imaginary fourth dimension to compensate for motions in the third. To me, that's a form of escapism, and that's why science is not really science anymore. It's more like scientism. And if you know, there's always again, you've got superstring theory in the 11th super dimension, the 11th dimensions of string theory. You've got all these different additions to gravity. As they find new discoveries, they have to create new math formulas for the previous one to make sense and fit into the mold. And as Russell would say, if you can't explain the universe to a 7-year-old, you're in the wrong business. So really, it's a lot simpler than we've made it out to be. The effects of cause are so multitudinous and complex that we have gone with our material senses into basically a box canyon. And we need to start over. We need to come back out of that box canyon and start back from a point of knowing. You know, it's easier to know your the creation than it is to try and analyze its effects. And if you just look at the multitudinous amounts of data, bulk data that has to be gathered on all these different, you know, experiments and things like that, whereas cause is a very simple one idea, and it can be known in the mind. You know, much to say that you can't really prove love exists in a laboratory, but we all know it does. How do we know? Because we know that we know that we know. And this is what science lacks the benefit of, knowing. It's always about sensing. It's always about proving empirically and reducing everything to quantitative formats of sensible data. Again, you can't reduce love to a sensory perception. It is something beyond sensory. It's a timeless idea, but it can be known by the mind. And so can many other things.
And of course, in conventional studies, we're taught one half the equation. We're taught that things move in one direction. I've always thought of time as, you know, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Walter would explain as something like data being compressed, you know, and sort of stratified along the way if you're just looking at the compression half of the cycle. And if we're hypnotized into that unidirectional flow as we are in our mindset, the way we're taught, then you are going to experience those increments as time frames. Whereas if you're back on the fulcrum and seeing the, you know, the flow in both directions simultaneously, you realize that, you know, that isn't happening. And then it gets into another thing. I just want to get your explanation on it, which is gravity. And I think it's good that we're hitting all these kind of single topics today, because those are the things I get asked to me all the time, like, well, what about gravity? What about, you know, this and that? And so if you're looking at stratifying data and compressing and explaining that as, you know, maybe an experience of time, also we're talking about that data being compressed under pressure, you know, because that's the way the electrical hydraulic, the way I think of it, you know, works. And on the other hand, if you're looking at the electrical vectors, how would I say it? Not just in terms of stratification for, you know, to create that pressure to experience time, but also to create the pressure differentials that bodies occupying different pressures and are constantly seeking balance with each other, which in fact explains what gravity really is, rather than a separate force in nature that somehow makes everything obey its wishes.
Right.
I think
Well,
you could probably explain that a lot better.
In the Universal One, Russell had more than one force. He revised his work later, and the greatest clarification and maturation of his work was to be found in the book Atomic Suicide. You can skip the whole first intro monologue and go straight to the first chapter if you wish, because that's really where they cover more of the history of radioactive, the use of the death half of the wave of elements as an energy source. So ultimately, he would later come to clarify in that book that electricity is the only force in the universe, and it does a seeming two things. It compresses and it expands. So speaking of gravity, just imagine again that inverted galaxy picture. It's such a great photographed, you know, and there's many of them. And you can even take yourself, if you have Adobe Photoshop or any other editing software, you can take a picture of any series of pictures of Hubble of the galaxies, of space, any of it, and you just go to edit and invert the picture. And what is black becomes white, and what is light becomes dark. And so there is that, again, that field of the mind of God, which is omnipresent. And that explains how consciousness can be omnipresent as well, because it doesn't just appear in Missouri or in California. Consciousness is wherever your body goes. That's because it is omnipresent, though your body is limited and confined to a material planet. So gravity is actually stillness. And what happens in the division of that white light in that field, wherever a thing is born, be it a star, a planet, or a human. Let's just take the sperm and the egg, for instance. When that sperm enters into the egg, a division takes place. Well, that very first division creates two poles, which are called gravity poles in Russell science, because they don't move. They're points of stillness, which basically hold and center and bound the motions of the spirals that meet. So you have basically 3 points set up: a center point, 2 points appear called poles, and then the rhythmic balanced interchange begins between those three, which again, you have your 3, and then you have your 6 planes of the cube, and then your 9 with your 8 corners and center, which create the motions. So ultimately, gravity is stillness. Gravity is that which does not move. It's the polarity. Again, we live in a polarized universe. So by having 3 distinct points, that center point and the 2 poles of gravity, that creates the polarity, which then creates the reversals, which then create the rhythm. And so the heart itself, you know, does not form for quite a bit later on in the embryo. What is pumping the blood then? So the heart is more an implosion device rather than a pump, because the blood is imploding through, you know, the fetus until the heart eventually, or the embryo, until the heart begins to form. So ultimately, gravity is in control, but it's better to think in terms that gravity is stillness, which controls the motions through the poles and through the center point, which is also what happens to create the three-dimensional spherical reality. So your first plane, your inertial plane, and then you're finally completing the cubic, forms of body. And we are cubic in our nature. We have a front, a back, a left, a right, a top, and a bottom. We are literally cubic in nature, and all of our cells spherical. So our very bodies themselves are the experimental evidence, or they're the evidence that we need when we want to analyze and line up Russell's science. You look at any body starting with your own, you can clearly know that you have two hemispheres, you're bounded, you have your own space around you. And that's why people who have a very large wave field of sensory perception, sometimes they like to avoid crowds. Some people can feel when they're at a store, someone walks by and they're like, my God, what's wrong with them, right? Why do we feel those things? Because our wave fields are interchanging, and that radars into our field. And so when we see images on TV of violence, it affects the wave field, and so it's very important to consider, again, the life half of the wave, which is basically nature's the perfect demonstrator of the life half of the wave. There is also the death half of the wave. But for humans, the reason why we keep shooting ourselves in our own feet and entering into dark ages periodically and seeing our civilizations dissolve, because we haven't learned to focus on but only on the death half of the wave for the most part. And we get what we focus on. So as we're multiplying the death half of the wave, we're seeing the arts crumble. We're seeing, more and more decadence in the arts and in the culture and in the very things people do and how they interact with each other. The Russells stress that the need of both is very important. And to look at nature is to really see such continuity. That's why nature doesn't rise and fall. Nature doesn't collapse like man's civilizations do, because it's achieved a perfect balance between its opposites. And that's what we can learn from ourselves. To enact and to mimic nature is going to be our saving grace in the end of this.
Yeah. So on the gravity side of things, real quick, in terms of the electrical idea, you could think of almost as like an anode and diode. As you talk about the poles of stillness there, is that kind of an analogy that would work too?
Yeah, you got your anode, your cathode. Take a guitar, for instance.
Yeah.
Let's look over here at my bass guitar. Let's see if I can. Okay, so here, the top of the guitar, you have your tuning knobs, and you can see here's a point of zero. This would be a point of gravity where there's no motion. Down here at the base of the guitar, you have another point of zero motion, or a gravity pole, you could say. But when you pluck that string, it vibrates, right? But what doesn't move? The 2 points, the top and the bottom, do not move. They are still. Another example, and this is a great thing to realize too, is that Russell would always say, you can't have duality without a fulcrum. So start noticing the fulcrum in your world. Start seeing what the door moves on, which is a jam that doesn't move. What does the tires of your car move on? Stillness, right? Everything moves upon stillness. And that is your way to envision locating the gravity shaft, which is always 2 poles. So I would say just always remember, as a student of the Russells, the greatest thing you can inculcate and burn into your consciousness is to know there's always 3. This is not a duality. We live in a triality. Everything that is dual moves on something that does not move. And I think understanding that which does not move is, that's the great mystery that mankind is slowly learning to discover. And I think the more we discover that which doesn't move, the more we discover God, because that is the ultimate, the penultimate realization is that the prime actuality of this universe is one of absolute equilibrium.
So as we're fond of saying in spiritual circles about raising our frequency, it's really not about raising our frequency, it's about being still.
Well, the more still you are, the more you can entertain, I should say, the stiller you are, the further out your awareness goes into the field. You know, it's very hard to do jumping jacks and try to meditate. If you have a fever, that's a very a hardcore death wave, radioactive kind of mode of being for a human being. You know, you're sweating, you're 104 degrees, it's close to death, right? That's a very high vibration. An earthquake is an extremely high vibration. Look what it does to a liquor store. My God. You know, just all the broken glass and the destruction. Anything destructive is in the death half of the wave. That's why the Russells warned us against using plutonium and uranium, which are highly deadly metals, which have a purpose thousands of feet below the earth with creating humus and breaking up soil and rocks so that it can create water. It has its purpose where it is, where its pressure condition is. But when we dig that stuff up, bring it to the surface, purify it, and then light it on fire with a reaction, you know, that's why our science is so far ahead of itself that it can't see the effects of its own cause. And so they have, how can we call ourselves advanced in science when we can't put out fires that we start? You know, it's ludicrous to think we're advanced when we can't even, you know, look what they're doing with Fukushima. They've run out of places to store the water. And I know there's a lot of people who might think, oh, you know, radioactivity is not true. Well, you go out, sit out in the sun naked long enough and tell me radioactivity is a lie or a conspiracy. Yeah, tell me when your body's sunburned with 3rd degree, there's no such thing as radioactivity. I mean, I don't know where people get these conspiracies, but it's absolutely, you know, radioactivity is a dangerous thing, and we should be very wary of using it as a fuel source.
Matt, in terms of Fukushima, when I remember when that all happened, I had the major freak out on that, and it's funny how amnesic humankind is, right? That's kind of like been forgotten. Meanwhile, that's just a septic tank of radioactivity going into the ocean, and very scary. But as Walter talks about the age of transmutation, what is your idea in terms of our ability to transmute these radioactive particles or this waste into something that's beneficial to help humanity? Is that something that is easily achievable if we have that technology or know-how?
If we put the effort into restoring our oceans to a more balanced rhythm, in the way that we did with trying to make ventilators in this country during this recent COVID, you know, pandemic, then we could certainly do this and start reversing the effects of the damage that we've caused to our oceans. And again, Fukushima used so many water containers, huge, you know, 5,000 gallon water towers and drums, and they've completely filled the place with drums. And now they're just releasing the water into the ocean because they've run out of space to store it. It's unfortunate. But what we could do immediately is launch the effort. People see that it's very simple. That you just have to unlearn what you've learned when it comes to science, because it's not entirely accurate. If it was, we would not have these disasters. We would be able to deal with them, number one. So that tells me that the science isn't right. You know, and I'm not saying all science, particularly nuclear science, which created the likes of Fukushima and other, you know, catastrophes. But ultimately, we could affix every boat, every plane, every car with a small device that, much like a radiator, would intake air into it. It would electrically, gyroscopically transmute that air and release clean, pure hydrogen, oxygen, or whatever element you really wanted to. I mean, yeah, you could do this electrically, but we have to start thinking of the universe in terms of an electric universe as opposed to a gravitic radiative one. You know, when you understand that this two-way universe is not a one-way, but a two-way universe, It's not just a one, you try exhaling and keep on exhaling. You can't do it. And neither can the universe, because it's a body that was built with a dualistic motion. How can anything be mono in the universe? You know, again, the only mono is the mind field, and that's what creates the opposites. And that's what the mystics beg, that we get in touch with that which is super sensible. It's not supernatural, it's super sensible. It's beyond the senses. It can be known with the mind. And when we begin to think in terms of being the center of motion, you really begin to get behind motion and understand that the polarity, the duality of motion centered on a fulcrum can be electrically transmuted. Now, Russell said you could take large amounts of hydrogen and make it into gold. You know, people, when they finally understand transmutation as an electric cycle, an electric transformation of gyroscopic motion, all these boats, planes, cars, everything that's in motion, and including your cell, you could fix a backpack on that would run and clean the air as you walked. You know, we could literally transform the planet back to a healthy state. And I don't think it's unhealthy necessarily. You know, there's a lot of camps of people that argue for, you know, this and that. Is there global warming? Is it a hoax? Well, it could be a little of both. So ultimately, I think if we're going to solve these problems, we have to embrace a new way of looking at the universe. And I think one of the most complete, one of the most holistic, and one of the most seamless cosmologies I've ever personally discovered was Walter Russell's work. And I think to ignore the man because he put the creator back into creation where science removed him is no longer a feasible excuse, because he basically defined God to mean mind, and mind is being omnipresent. So if you think of God as consciousness and that omnipresent field of mind, then I think it's a much better way to approach his science. And it's really God 3.0. You know, we needed to upgrade to the operating system.
So since we're the original technology, then it doesn't seem that much of a stretch to me that within our own consciousness, the more we seek that fulcrum point and hold our consciousness there, that then we could perhaps be less vulnerable to these ionizing effects of nuclear radiation and that sort of thing as well, which also brings up another segue into 5G. I mean, isn't 5G have pretty much the same ionizing effects as far as what these microwaves are doing to us as well?
Well, there's different kinds of 5G, and basically, I just touched up on this the other day, and it's the millimeter waves, I think, are the ones that are dangerous, because what you're doing, and there's two different versions of 5G. So there's actually three. There's low, mid, and then high frequency. And the high frequency is what you want to avoid. And that's the kind of frequency that they're putting the antennas up every block, because it can be blocked by trees, it can be blocked by walls. It's basically a line of sight. And because the millimeter wave is so tightly compressed, when it hits a flat area or a tree, it scatters. It becomes discombobulated and is no longer an effective source of, you know, high stream transmission. So really the 5G millimeter waves, you know, and I would check into your local phone companies, whoever in town. I know I had to call Verizon, I had to call AT&T and ask them if we had 5G installed in the city of Salem, Missouri. We do not yet. We only have 4G, but they said they do plan on rolling out 5G. Now, whether or not it's millimeter, they didn't know, you know, or whether or not it's mid or low frequency. So ultimately, again, you know, you can go into your router and you can shut off your 5G in your router. I don't even know if the router is in fact, routers may be millimeter, because I noticed when mine was on, it didn't work in the living room, but it worked when I was directly in front of it. So I've turned all the, you know, 5G off on pretty much everything I own, and you can too. All you need to do is access your router and you can turn that off. But ultimately, if you live in a city where they're installing 5G, it can certainly have detrimental effects because of the millimeter wave. I mean, you're talking getting hit with a very compressed wave, you know, and much like a a stun gun is a compressed wave. You know, it's not the same, you know, in terms of voltage necessarily, but the damage on a cellular level is certainly, you know, something that should be questioned and more researched and more looked into for health and safety reasons.
Since we live in a waveform universe, it's not much of a stretch to imagine how these artificial waveforms are affecting every bit of our reality and consciousness. I wanted to ask a question. This is just kind of curiosity. I've never read anything as such, but did Walter Russell ever delve into or talk about the works of other people that preceded him, people like Rudolf Steiner, or, you know, folks of the old theosophical schools? Did he ever get into that?
In their home study course, they mentioned quite a lot of people. The writings of those people they called basically that they would be good co-studies to read, especially Dr. Richard Morris Buck's work, Cosmic Consciousness. They directly quoted from the Bhagavad Gita, which is an incredible work. A lot of this was, you know, even some things from Buddha, biblical teachings, things that Christ said, just to explain in a way how, you know, man is a part of God, not separate of God, that man should love God, not fear God, you know, and that this God of fear has created a world of fear. So there's been a lot of good co-inspirational teachings that they recommend. Again, some of the ones I named, there's Khalil Gibran. Their bookshelf was extensive, and we built a library at the museum just to be able to put their books on display, and as well as, you know, a few other books, but mostly their books. And it's literally 9 foot tall by 22 foot wide bookshelf filled with all the books that they read. And a lot of them are, you know, a lot of books on mysticism, a lot of books on different religions, you know, Egypt, and, you know, there's a great many works of people they studied, but, you know, there's in the home study course, I would say is a good list of books they recommend as a supplemental teaching.
Do you know if they
so in the home study,
go ahead there.
I was just going to say real quick, sorry, Mike, in the home study course, they have a lot of that information in the margins, I'm aware. So how much of that is the actual Russell's recommendations versus editors later on?
Well, I should say that we've discontinued the 4th edition of the home study course, and just as of today, put the 3rd edition, which was the last edited version by the Russells themselves, back up for sale on philosophy.org. So I'm pleased to say that I just call it an oversight of previous administrations to change things and insert footnotes has been corrected. We honor the wishes of our founders, which were that nobody change a word or so much as a sentence or a phrase. Yeah, and you're looking there at the 4th edition. So the 3rd edition.
It's the 4th. Really, it says 1st edition on the cover, so it's actually
right.
the 4th edition.
Well, the 4th edition went back to the 1st, basically, and then added footnotes, texturized it with more of a textbook approach. They removed the double spacing, which was, in my opinion, thoroughly against what the Russells wanted. The reason the Russells had double spacing in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd edition that they made were because they wanted you to see the space between the words, to absorb the space between the lines. You know, music would be a horrific thing if there was no silence between the notes. So in much the same way, they're trying to train us, to ask us to train ourselves to notice the gaps between motion, to notice the silence between sound, to notice the fulcrum between duality. You know, and a person that operates from their fulcrum is not a reactor, they're a responder. A person that operates from their fulcrum momentarily, for that still point, when a situation happens to them, they're more apt to make the proper choice instead of reacting to it. You know, and that's why I said earlier that there's a small group of people in the Russell student body who have these teachings misunderstood to their detriment. They think literally that if you put love out in the world, it creates hate somewhere else in the rest of the world. And you got to be very careful about people who say such things, because nothing could be further from the truth. And we even have Russell on tape saying it himself, that a man who puts out hate will swing at both ends of the pendulum, whereas a man who puts love out to the world will discover that love swings at both ends of the pendulum.
This is my favorite book of Walter Russell, The Universal One. Mm-hmm. And I just grabbed this because, when you gave the analogy of music, to me, this reads like music. Mm-hmm. And I love his style. He keeps repeating. It's like a song where you repeat certain verses and go to the chorus, but he'll kind of give a little bit of a different slant each time. So, when you get used to that style, you realize, wow, there is a method to the madness, because by the end of the topic, you've got it from so many different angles and heard it so many times that it really starts to sink in.
Right. And Russell mastered music. So when he wrote the Divine Iliad, when he wrote the Universal One, The Secret of Light, he used a divine meter in his writing style. I don't think it's ever been discovered, but it flows like it's spirit flowing. And it's very incredible. And I've had just multiple people call and email and say that Russell's words have this incredible progressive meter, this rhythm that really lifts your soul. And I've often said, I've read other authors, many of them, about different things from different researches, and where I might get one nugget of truth out of one of those books, out of Russell, it seems like I get a nugget of truth on every single page throughout the whole book. So it's like popcorn going off in your head, lights of popcorn, popping, and realizations. You have to set the book down and think to yourself for a second, wow, what did he just say? That's incredible, and the inspiration gleaned from it is really an incredible feeling too. And I think, in my opinion, if we're going to change this world from the drab and the inequality that so many people perceive, it has to be done with inspiration, which is, again, the life half the wave. You're really going to affect a lot more people by embracing life rather than embracing death and destruction, which only produces and multiplies more death and destruction, which is also divisive. The death half of the wave is division. The life half of the wave is union. So you tell me which is going to help the human race more. And we've been coached, trained, indoctrinated by academia, media, education, medicine, science, religion, to worship the death half of this wave of creation. You have the great mystics who point you to the life half of the wave. And I think that's where that choice, knowing when death is proper to use and when life is proper to use. Again, you have to cut your lawn. You have to cut up a chicken if you want to eat. You have to pry vegetables out of the ground. Either way, man has to kill when he must kill, but do so when when it helps give life, as opposed to killing for the sake of destruction and killing, because you're just multiplying death at that point.
Yeah. Someone like David Icke would say that the cult of Baal has kind of really influenced mankind for thousands of years, which is the worshiping of the death cycle of that death, and we've seen that influence in pop culture. We see it all around us, and there's almost a subconscious worshiping of it in our society and our culture. Meanwhile, I think humanity right now, we're seeing, is just really yearning for the opposite. Really yearning for justice and life and peace and harmony. I think most humans really want that. I just think we're in a philosophical quandary right now that we don't have the tools to initiate and get that. So someone like Walter Russell, and understanding this, I think, as you said, what I loved what you said, Matt, was about the God 3.0. And it's something we really need right now, because it really fits into our modern mind and how we can really appreciate the universe in this way, because it really does fit into what where we've evolved to as of now. And it's very much simple as picking up Atomic Suicide. I think that book is anybody could pick up and start reading and really get into. Universal One gets pretty intense. And it's like reading, I feel like I'm in literature class reading poetry, where you are right. You have to set it down. Like I was reading it again last night and I was nodding off because it's just so, it is pretty intense reading. But the atomic suicide is something that I really enjoy. And I mean, all the works of Walter, and I want to get more and more and just really get into Walter more and more. So we'll leave links too on the show notes here where folks can get these books directly from source. And Universal One is a must own. I've got mine right here, bookmarked. and
Right.
What I was going to ask when we were talking about other influences, do the Russells ever mention hermetics and hermetic laws? Because I feel like a lot of that is in here. I was just reading about the sex principle, and that seems to relate to the principle of gender. And of course, we were talking about, the polarity. We're talking about as above, so below. Seems like there's a lot of similarities between these two.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to note all the different sexes that are socially being constructed. Again, God works very simply. You take two and you divide it into four. Again, that's the death half of the way of worshiping, death over life. So wherever death is, you will find division, and you'll find lots of it. And the faster it divides, the more destructive it becomes. A fire, for instance, is a very rapid multiplication of the death half of the wave. It's the ultimate consumer of bodies, but it takes 60 years to build an oak tree in nature that's 50 feet tall and weighs 100 tons. It takes 30 seconds to saw it down with a chainsaw, and then maybe a few hours if you cut it into firewood and pile it all on top of each other. So nature does things over very long periods of time where again, man seems to be on this hell-bent worship of the death half of the wave. In terms of, could you rephrase your question? You had gone on a point about
Hermetics.
Yeah, hermetics.
Well, my question was just, did the Russells ever mention specifically hermetic principles? The 7 principles, because there seems to be a lot of similarities in terms of the different laws that they say are universal laws. And what I find so attractive to the hermetic notions is that they really are, they're laying out like a universal code of mind that seems to be very similar in a lot of respects. But I feel like the Russells took it to the next level in explaining the sort of mechanics behind it and the actual physics behind it. So I was just curious if they ever actually straight up mentioned these hermetic laws, like the law of gender, the law of polarity, etc.
Understood. They did not directly mention, for instance, the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, but they did, I believe, in a few instances, speak of Hermeticism, but not so directly as to mention an author to read or necessarily to even study Hermetics, classical Hermetics or not. But ultimately, there's some people who assert that Russell had based his cosmogony off of the Kabbalion, which isn't, I don't believe that's necessarily true, because I couldn't, number one, there's no copy of the Kabbalion in their large book collection. We do have copies of everything that Walter owned, his own personal book collection. And yeah, I've got that too. That pretty much lines up, except for one of the laws of vibration, I think it is, that says God spins at a very high frequency, at a very high vibration. Walter would absolutely disagree with that. And that's where, being a person that studied both, I could see that being as the main glaring difference between the philosophies that, the so-called 3 initiates taught in the Kabbalion, and then Walter Russell. The Russells, again, they were quoted as saying, there's absolutely no vibration to the spirit whatsoever. And they even termed their work meta-science. They said, our work is not metaphysical, it is meta-scientific, and the difference is great. Great. Not just mediocre, but great. In other words, all their assertions can be backed up with scientific proof, evidence of these motions that Walter wrote of. And so ultimately, you know, you also, if you go and view the works of Lao Tzu, you could, Meister Eckhart, I could name 100 people that write about God being stillness. You know, even in the Nazarene's own words, seek ye the kingdom of heaven within, be still and know, right? So again, this idea that you have to raise your vibrations, which once you go above carbon in the octave wave, once you get above carbon in your vibrational frequency, your body starts to die. So that's why our midpoint at 40 years of age, we're the healthiest we are. And that's why Walter said great men and women come alive at 40 years old, because that's the maturation of our carbon state in our own wave. We are that wave in the lifetime of a body that begins at birth, matures to its midpoint, and then dies over the next 40 years. At some point, death will overtake life in the wave of our own bodies. We'll start to radiate faster than we can compress. And so the life force begins to leave. It just takes 40 years to do it. So when they suggest that we raise our vibration, you know, literally what you're doing is you're vibrating into the death half of the wave of creation. Like I said, a fever is akin to a radioactive state of the human body. Why would anybody want to pursue that? You know, and I think we need to call these fallacies out. And you know, these are things that could actually take people off the path of enlightenment, as opposed to, you know, try going inside, become still. And in that stillness is where you hear the still small voice. They don't call it the loud vibrating loud voice. It's the still small voice, because it's silent and it's still, and it's dead center of every human body. And if more people listen to that still small voice, we wouldn't have burning cities. We wouldn't have racial riots. We wouldn't have people like, you know, insane psychopaths trying to vaccinate all of us. But unfortunately, these people are incapable of noticing silence, even though it's there. That's the power source where they can lift that arm and throw the rock through the window. You couldn't do it without that power source. But that was also one of the greatest things that Russell said regarding free will, coming back to free will, is that man can choose to kill with the sword, but by the sword he killeth with, he will also be killed. And so that's why division, multiplication, and the worship of the death half of the wave is only going to create more. And I think the manipulators of this planet know that very well, which is why they never broadcast messages to us about union. They never broadcast messages, and very rarely do you even see any movies or films anymore that are life-giving films and uplifting, inspirational films. You really have to dig in very obscure places to find anything inspirational.
And most of those are panned by the critics as like religious or, you know.
Of course. Yeah. But here's this dark superhero who's, you know, let's pit the good guys against each other in Batman versus Superman Part 19. You know, how much darkness can we be, you know, can we absorb? How much death, how much worship of destructive, degenerative art can we take? You know, even our architecture is gone beyond the pale. You know, the strip mall, for instance, is a perfect example. But
Bear, go ahead. And then I wanted to ask Matt something, but I know you got something on the tip of your tongue.
It was just a quick remark. You know, Walter is lamenting in Atomic Suicide how bad things are in the world, and how that, you know, decades ago when we unearthed the first, you know, radioactive elements, how it was the beginning of the end. I can't imagine what he would think if he was here looking around now. It's just gone so extreme. I just want to comment also on Walter, you know, saying that he, in his own life, demonstrated the ability to elongate that maturation phase and kind of forestall the decline. So it shows that we can, you know, perhaps manipulate even our own biology to a certain extent, you know, if our consciousness is fixated in the right place. But go ahead,
right.
Mike.
Well, that was kind of where I was getting at, because we talk about the death, the death cycle and hitting 40 and then going downhill. But it seems like we have historically, some foundational evidence that maybe mankind used to live a lot longer. And this goes all the way back to these like Atlantis days. Just curious if the Russells ever talked about Atlantis. Like we talked about Steiner early. He talks about the ages since the Atlantis fall. And he actually talks about how in like around the 1500s, we had a big shift in consciousness, that we were started to be more mind centric. And before we were more kind of living in a dream world in terms of how we related to reality. And I was just curious in terms of if the Russells discussed Atlantis at all, or like ancient history like that. Relating to our ability to kind of transmute our own health in a way that where we can have more longevity with this understanding of how these waves work.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, again, what are you taking in? Number one, is it death or is it life? So we breathe in the death of plants called oxygen and exhale death, and the plants breathe in the carbon dioxide. So there we have that mutual interchange. Interesting that if we wear masks, we're literally forcing ourselves to breathe our own dead breath. I find that interesting because, yeah. And so you're breathing in death at about 40 to 60% more in each breath by wearing a mask, which can't be healthy. Hypoxia comes to mind. There's a lot of reasons not to wear a mask, and a lot of reasons why. I would say, again, the powers that never were, who just assume power, would like us all to, cowtail and do whatever they say. But ultimately, a healthy mindset, Russell, there's a quote he gave, "Turn thine eyes from all that is unlovely." I think he lived by that. He knew how to utilize his day and his night. His night was about expressing through action, through thoughtful action, a creative, glorious life. That's why he mastered the 5 fine arts with only a 4th grade education. He could literally do anything he put his mind to. And I think his message to us was that so can we. And I took that to heart. When I went to visit Swannanoa in 2010, I wasn't of the best health. I wasn't of the, but I was on the path toward it. And so since then, I looked and found in 2010 that all his artwork was in a warehouse, and then it became my desire to get it back out to the world. And if you would have told me in 2010, one day you'll open the Russell Museum and be president of the University of Science and Philosophy, I would have laughed you out of the room. But based on one's desire, which toward the life half, to build, to create, it's thoroughly there. You just have to work for it. And I think in the working, in the action of life, creating life choices that are from the life half of the wave and pointed toward the life half of the wave, you're creating the kind of life, not only for yourself, but a life for life around the lives of those around you. It can only benefit one to have balance in their own home. Have you ever seen somebody try to give you advice whose home is a wreck, whose marriage is completely torn apart? They have no business giving advice to anybody else on how to balance themselves. Or you find a lot of that in the New Age, this idea that these great spiritual teachers that are propped up, or when their own lives are in turmoil, but again, the ultimate guide to, and I would say what Russell might put forth as to a way of increasing longevity for your life, is to focus on the life half of the wave, to do things that are life-giving. And that also means eating right. That also means exercise. That also means, taking time to quietly contemplate things, not making rash decisions, and certainly going and sinning no more. I mean, that's not some of the best advice we've ever heard. Stop hurting yourself. Start to notice, analyze psychologically, what are the things that you do in your life that keep bringing pain and suffering and misery to yourself. And I like to say too, there's nobody on this planet who's hurt myself more than myself. And, when we start to realize that we are our own worst enemy, when we start to notice the patterns of mind that are pointed toward death and keep reproducing death effects and turn those patterns off, you know, integrate them in a shadow work way, as Jung might, you know, point out, and then focus our consciousness toward giving life to ourselves, which then allows us to give it out to the world. I think that's what produces the longevity. That's how oak trees, you know, last for hundreds of years. That's why nature has continuity. Because if it was only focused on death, all we experience is volcanic eruptions and earthquakes all the time, right? But
yeah, you mean oak trees aren't victims?
yeah, exactly. Yeah, and if humans were more like oaks in their character, we wouldn't be victims either. So.
And isn't it interesting that even in longevity endeavors, it becomes anti-aging or prevention of disease, and it just brings us back into body consciousness again.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, so it's a delicate dance. It's it's like, yeah, understanding the principles, but not focusing on the materialistic. But it seems like in the health movement, it brings you right back to the same old box all over again.
You have a multi-billion-dollar industry in anti-aging. And I think, you know, I've said this in past interviews and I've quoted Leo, but there's a certain beauty in a woman as she ages. And why cover that up? You know, I told my Lori years ago, I said, let the gray come in. She'd religiously once a month go to the hairdresser and get the hair dyed and try to keep I said, look, I love your soul, you know, be who you are, grow old gracefully and accept yourself. And since she's done it, and now she's got these gray, what look like gray highlights, and some of her friends who are women say, your hair's so pretty, where'd you get it done? She's like, that's just the natural gray. They think the gray is actually highlights, but there is a certain beauty to all things as they age. And I think women especially would at least consider that, you know, that a possibility to, you know, especially if you have a mate that, you know, sees you as his equal and a soulmate. He'll be the kind of man that says, you know what, you're beautiful as you are, and don't cover that up. You know, you don't need to spend a fortune to look young. I love you just like you are. And again, that's also comes from self-acceptance. You know, there's the guy, of course, who that unbalance in the home, he leaves the wife and kids for some gal who's 21 and buys a, you know, convertible. Look how that usually ends, right? So anyways, it's, you know, again, life begets life, death begets more death, but each one is imperative to the other. But we have the free will choice to worship neither, but use either when you're fulcrumized, when you're centered. When you are out of center, it's always one versus the other. You're always going to be in division, one against the other, science versus religion, spirit versus matter, materialist science versus idealism. You're always going to have these different camps. And I think that the new cosmic man is going to be one who's learned to balance his own hemispheres, who's learned to balance the wave of life and death, which is the secret of creation, as Russell put it. And then he'll be best able to utilize his knowledge to create the kind of world that is that has continuity in the same way nature does. You know, we won't see our civilizations rise and fall anymore. We'll be able to maintain it because we understand how imperative it is to mimic nature and its balance of male and female opposites.
Beautiful.
So, Mike, unless you have other questions.
Yep, I got a couple questions.
Okay.
We'll wrap it up.
Go for it. I was just going to maybe get into Matt's music before we finish, because I've been tracking a lot of your creative endeavors, but go ahead with your questions, Mike.
Just a couple quick ones from the Peanut Gallery.
Mm-hmm.
What book does Matt recommend for a first read to a person new to Walter Russell?
I will always say The Secret of Light. That book, I read it in about 3 weeks, and upon finishing it, I shut the book. Lori looked at me and said, "Did you like it?" I said, I never need to read another book as long as I live. To me, it laid the universe out and taught me the language of light. It literally is the secret of light. He teaches you to understand the language of the birds, as it was known in Hermeticism, which is the language of light, which is inspiration. So that's always my recommendation for folks. It's like a very nice balance of the science and the philosophy. presented in that divine meter in a way that just transforms you upon the first reading. But a lot of people start with, you know, The Man Who Tapped the Secrets of the Universe. Others who are more scientifically oriented start with New Concept of the Universe. But, you know, it's really, you could ask your heart too, which book should I start with? And for me, you know, I always recommend The Secret of Light.
Wonderful. And one more, this is a text from a friend watching. What was Walter's viewpoint on reincarnation?
He basically said reincarnation is repetition. And he and Leo went over reincarnation, which is repetition of bodies in nature, that there's absolute proof everywhere that nature is a repetition of idea. And that idea is soul, idea is mind, and it unfolds into bodies and then refolds back into itself. So they didn't use terms like life and death to connote the passing of a human being. In fact, they preferred the terms unfolding and refolding. For instance, Walter Russell refolded on May 19th, 1963. And in much the same way, nature unfolds and refolds. And it unfolds from one thing, the seed. There is no seed that grows only in one direction. You always have roots, and you'll always have what's above the root system in two different directions. Again, you have your poles of opposites of gravity. And one directs the upward and one directs the downward, or the outward and the inward, and so on and so forth. But ultimately, nature is proof of repetition. The leaves that come back on the trees every year. There's multiple stories and accounts of children who have exhibited past life memories. Hundreds of accounts of people who have experienced, you know, visions of a former life. You have tens of thousands of documented near-death experiences where people know that there's no death. And I would just say, to add to that, if you type in "why you cannot die," and first you can go to my YouTube page. I did do a video presentation called "Why You Cannot Die," which uses the words of Leo Russell's book. Or you could type in TEC Unit 19, and that should directly bring up that unit. And she wrote an incredible book called "Why You Cannot Die." And she goes greatly into reincarnation and the repetition of nature and bodies, and that man as an idea is indestructible. That's why we say ideas are bulletproof, because they can't die. And what doesn't die is the soul. The soul of man is immortal, just like the soul of nature is immortal, the soul of the oak tree. You know, you can dissect an acorn into infinitesimally small pieces and never find the image of a 50-foot tall, 100-foot tall, 50-ton oak tree. It's not anywhere in the acorn. But plant the acorn in the ground and come back in 50 years, and behold, it stands before you. You know, so the idea is bulletproof. The idea of man is bulletproof, and the idea of you as a soul is immortal and bulletproof.
Can you give us a real brief explanation of the role of the inert gases in all of that?
Sure. The inert gases are on the equilibrium as close. They're the only. They're the master tones of the elements, Russell called them, and they are closest to the divisionary line of equilibrium. And basically, the white light uses the inert gases, which we've concluded must also be omnipresent. The white light projects through the inert gases to create the myriads of forms in the universe. And that's why inert gases can't combine with any other elements. They are the master keys, the master tones of the elements, the master keys of each octave. And those inert gases act in much the same way lenses do. For instance, the white light of a movie projector shines through the lens to create the image on the white screen of space, which again, that white screen is much like the inverted galaxy. Why is the screen white? So that it can reflect the color spectrum. You know, a black screen will not reflect anything. So though it may be dark to our senses, to our minds, we can know it. And many mystics have entered into that white light and written to tell about it. And we all have that white light, and that light projects through the inert gases, which creates creation.
And
And
is there
it also
Sorry.
stores the records of all motions. So
Yeah.
in much the same way, the inert gases could be thought of as the Akashic record or the Akashic substance.
So
yeah, that was my next question. Thanks.
So we should get those inert gases. Like I know Bear has some, right? You have those in like special capsule or something. I mean, it'd be interesting to know what we can do with these technologies.
I've been experimenting with inert gas devices in tonal fields and things for a long time. So I wish I had a few $1 million and a staff of people to really go for it, but I just get to play with it by myself. So Mike, if you don't have any more questions, maybe Matt, can you just tell us a little bit about what you're up to these days with your music and your video projects and where people might find those even?
Right. Well, I was so busy last year, spent 8 months in Virginia away from home here in Missouri, that I haven't had a whole lot of time to do a lot of production. I aim to get back into it. As far as music goes, again, I haven't had really a lot of time, and I've been so busy in the yard getting my gardens going and the fish and, you know, building the chicken coop and learning to raise chickens. But all of these things last year I was centered around the museum and being away from home. This year I'm more centered around being home and involved with things around here. And I do plan to get more into music production, and also to produce some things on Walter Russell. I'd like to do a 2-hour documentary feature film at some point, maybe to release in the next couple of years, that goes more into his life and his works from a deeper perspective. If people want to get a hold of me, they can visit Matt Presti, MattPresti.com. You can click on videos there. My YouTube page is youtube.com/Matt Presti. On social media, you can find me on Facebook, facebook.com, Matt Presti Official, and then minds.com/Matt Presti.
Very good. I'm sharing that right now in the chat. And I think that's a good way to leave off this discussion. Thanks so much, Matt. We'll make sure to get all your links in the show notes. For those listening right now, you can find this. This will be on YouTube at youtube.com/AlphaVedic. Of course, this is also be a audio podcast everywhere podcasts are. You can also go to alphavedic.com and go to the Alfacast page there, and we'll have that up. We'll have this episode up with all the links to Matt's socials and his website and projects, etc. Also, we have recently launched our new website. If you haven't seen it yet, please go check it out, alphavedic.com. We're offering some new product lines and a new co-op that we've started that's really exciting. You can join there at patreon.com/AlphaVedic. Our Physic Garden Co-op is really growing fast, and we're working on a number of different resources and solutions for co-op members, from gardening and permaculture tips to health tips. We just launched a Q&A for co-op members yesterday on Patreon. So it's a really an amazing resource. You also get discount to the store and just really become part of something that we're growing here. So please, if you want to support this channel, support this information and the show, that's probably one of the best ways, patreon.com/AlphaVedic. And of course, we have an amazing community on Telegram, t.me/AlphaVedic. You can join us there for the general daily discussions we have going on there, from all sorts of funny memes to videos to just an amazing flow of consciousness on there. We love our Telegram community. So thanks, you guys, for all the support. And of course, we stream this every Thursday at 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time on DLive, dlive.tv/AlphaVedic. You can join in, ask questions, join in the conversation as we do this. So thanks, everybody. And Matt, thank you so much. We're so grateful for you and being here on this planet and spreading the message of Walter and Lau. Really, like I said in the beginning, needed more than ever. Embracing that life waveform that we need right now so badly. And I'm an eternal optimist, so I try to ride that wave as much as I can, and we will spread this podcast far and wide so more people can be elevated to those notions. So thanks again so much for joining us today. And
hey, Mike, if I may just add real quickly.
Yeah.
Philosophy.org is the official website for Walter and Leo Russell and the University of Science and Philosophy. And before I forget, for your listeners, those who've hung on this long to the very end, if you go to philosophy.org/store and you want to order the books, just for Alpha Vedic listeners, when you check out, enter coupon code AlphaVedic20. Okay, that's all caps, AlphaVedic20, one word, AlphaVedic20, and you'll save 20% off on your order. I will get that coupon code made as soon as we hang up.
Wow, that's amazing. Thank you. And I'm going to take advantage of that. I want to get another poster.
Thanks so much, Matt.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. So great. I wish we had another 2 hours. Maybe we can do this again some other time, because as you know, we're just scratching the surface with all of Walter Russell's work. So
I think that goes for all of us. Yeah, there's so much to scratch.
Yeah.
Yeah. But
like our chickens.
Everything's a chicken reference lately.
I have chickens too. We're all chicken. We all keep chickens. So, well, thanks so much, Matt. Thank you guys for joining us, and have a beautiful day. Go outside, get your hands dirty, grow something, go in nature, go for a nature walk, whatever you can do.
Create, live life.
Yes. Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you. Thank you.